Why do you think the government's trying to legalise speed, ice, meth, the harder drugs? Why do you think there is that push?
Because, along with many other things, I don't think the government has our best interest at heart. I think that there'll be big business that are pushing for this because there'll be money to be made.
Do you feel there's an agenda behind it, or it is as simple as that? What's that agenda?
The agenda is, chaos makes life easier for politicians.
Avi Yamini for Rebel News in Melbourne, Australia. Today doing something a little bit different. I'm catching up with a local businessman, former police officer and current anti-drug campaigner that has something he wants to share with us and has been bugging me for a while to share it. And it is important, so welcome Peter.
Thanks, Harvey.
I'm glad we finally made the time to chat about this important issue. Yep. So why do we need to have this chat?
Because we're in Victoria and probably Australia heading down the path of decriminalisation, inevitably leading to legalisation of marijuana and again inevitably leading to the legalisation of most drugs. A very dangerous path to take, and other jurisdictions such as states in America and Canada have already found that out.
Personally, I'm a bit conflicted about this issue, different parts of it, as somebody that struggled with heroin myself as a teenager, spent a lot of time in rehabs, so I kind of understand that world, and I see both sides of these arguments. What is your biggest fear in legalising drugs, and is it all drugs?
Yes, it is all drugs, and I suppose there's some drugs are obviously worse than others and going to create more problems than others, but they will all create problems. And the problems won't be just for the user, it'll be for the whole of society. And if we decriminalise, legalise, there will be more users, hence more harm, undoubtedly. And places like Oregon, who are now reversing their the laws of decriminalisation due to the disaster that has brought to them.
And what got you into this?
Strangely enough, I've always been anti-drugs, but I also now have I would say long-term family member who's an ice addict, and I see the harm that it's done to her.
So, let's say they decriminalised ice. Is that a direct concern for you when it comes to your daughter, or what's the concern?
Well, the fact is, my daughter is already an ice addict. Decriminalising is not going to make a difference to her. The difference that needs to be made to her is that she needs to be taken off the streets and rehabilitated, and there isn't the facilities for that, and that's where we should be concentrating undoubtedly, is getting addicts off the street and getting them into rehabilitation. The fact is that most ice addicts in particular, but it's going to be the developing problem with fentanyl, etc. There's going to be a lot more addicts soon committing crimes, but most meth addicts will commit crimes, hence they go through the court system. And there's our opportunity to put them in rehabilitation. Our daughter has been in jail on remand, 2 different stints, and people in remand don't get treated for their drug addiction. She left jail, time served, and never received any treatment for her addiction. Hence, she goes back on the streets, doing the same thing again, and doing an incredible harm to herself.
And others, I'm assuming?
Yeah, well, others, that's why she ended up in jail, yeah.
Is part of the problem that you're saying that the government's focusing on the wrong issues when it comes to fighting the societal problem of drug addiction? So, for example, in Victoria, we see this push for drug safety injecting facilities.
I feel those facilities are sometimes keeping people alive to keep going with the horrible existence that they're living. Instead of taking them off the street and treating them, they're basically keeping them alive to go and do the same thing again, be revived again, and eventually it will end their life. It's just a matter of time. I can see a slight argument that, yeah, keeping them alive gives them more time to actually then decide that they don't want to be on drugs. But those people aren't making a decision whether they want to be on drugs or don't want to be on drugs. The decision about them being on drugs is being made by the drug and their brain, the chemicals in their brain. They keep going back to it. They need to deny access to the drugs so that they can be off the drugs and then make a conscious decision to not go back to them.
So, like I said to you before, I'm conflicted, a little bit conflicted. I've got my own kind of where I've landed my positions on this, and I think when I look at something like marijuana, weed, whatever the kids are calling it these days, I feel is much less of an issue, for example, compared to something like alcohol. And of course, any harder drug beyond that. Do you not agree with that? Like, do you think that marijuana should also continue to be criminalised? And if so, why? And what's your concerns there?
Okay. There's a whole lot of ground to cover there, but the marijuana that's being sold today is not the marijuana that was around in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. The produced product now that people are buying is a lot more harmful than what it used to be. And that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that it's a drug that takes away people's drive, so they're less likely to actually contribute to society in as much as have a job, etc. They will continue to drive cars on marijuana, and that's a bad thing. Yeah, you could say, well, they do it on alcohol, but the figures for driving on alcohol are incredibly low now. But the biggest point that I want to make, it's not criminal, it's not enforced. The crime is not enforced now. So people aren't going to jail because they're on marijuana or they're carrying marijuana. They're not actually going to jail for meth. They wouldn't go to jail for fentanyl, etc. They're going to jail for what they've done while on the drug. If it had have remained as it was 30, 40 years ago, where there was the heroin problem, we should have been taking the people off the streets that were on heroin and helped them. Yeah. With marijuana, the police were leaving people alone on marijuana, and pretty much still are. And the fact is, if you're caught driving on marijuana or even meth, you do not go to jail. So really, how are they criminalised? What happens if you decriminalise in a literal sense is that you are going to be saying to young people, it is okay. Now, would you be saying to your kids that it's okay to take drugs?
Absolutely not. And, I've had my personal journey on it, but I guess, the argument about quality control, for example, which is one of the reasons why you're a bit worried now, as opposed to 30 years ago, I would think if you legalise it, then you were actually able to quality control it and you could go back to having a clean product. And when it comes to crimes committed on drugs, I agree with you, decriminalising hard drugs is certainly something that I would be against because of all the associated broader community, society issues that come with that, including crime and the breakdowns of families, everything. But when it comes to marijuana, I personally, I never liked it. I don't like it because it's a downer, but you don't see the crime associated to marijuana because the people are too stoned to be bothered committing crimes. They're, when you compare it to alcohol, for example, alcohol's far worse when you look at crime. Like, just go out any Saturday night or Friday night, you'll see the crime being committed, violent crimes being committed because of people that have consumed too much alcohol. So alcohol's a far worse drug when it comes to crime. And the quality control that we have on alcohol is only because there's no prohibition. If you look at the old days in America, you looked at prohibition, people were drinking ethanol. I guess I'm trying to understand, and the viewers would understand, is the problem the marijuana itself? legalising marijuana, or are you worried that that is the gateway drug, or is it that once we legalise that, then that's just really one step closer to legalising the next thing?
I'll just go back to the first thing. I'm going to come to that, absolutely. But what the point I was making about, you would say to your kids, don't take drugs, but the government is saying to our kids, it's okay to take drugs.
Yeah. I agree with you. Look, I think the government's totally wrong. The fact that we have safe injecting rooms in Melbourne when it's illegal to take drugs makes zero sense to me. The fact that you can go with drugs in your pocket, walk to a facility that's paid by the taxpayer, but then, those same streets, not too long ago, if you walked out there without a mask, you'd go to jail. It's just like, the system makes no sense. But, and I agree, the government gets it completely wrong, and I don't like giving the government, and that's almost an argument for me as to why I like to legalise this, because I think that I want less government interference. But at the same time, I feel like we have to draw a line, and this also probably comes from my personal experience. Like, I know the difference between something like marijuana to speed, ice, meth, even cocaine, but certainly heroin. That was my poison of choice. That's where I crashed in life, was on heroin, and that's arguably the worst, or I guess equivalent to ice in a way. Just they have they're completely different drugs, but I think the outcome is very similar. The crime that's associated to people.
I'll disagree with you on that one.
All right, I'm happy to hear that. The reason why I'd argue that is because the crime, a heroin addict is actually the nicest guy when he's high, but when he's desperate between hits, he'll do anything to make that money to be able to pay for the next hit, whereas an ice addict is a lot more dangerous in the moment while he's high, because you can punch him 100 times and he just doesn't feel it.
There's my point.
Yeah, no, they're completely different drugs. What I was trying to argue is that the outcome, so the crime associated to it, and the fear, from what I understand, your fear is as soon as you legalise it, you're going to have far more, addicts, which is going to bring up all of that.
Yep.
But I just don't see that to marijuana. And that's where I'm trying, I've had this conversation with a lot of people in good faith like we have now, and I can agree with the latter, not decriminalising harder drugs, but why shouldn't we decriminalise something like marijuana if alcohol is decriminalised?
Because marijuana, for some people, is a gateway drug. My main argument is that to some degree it's a gateway drug in a different way, in as much as it will just lead to the decriminalisation. And the fact is, people around the world, they're not going, let's decriminalise marijuana. They're going, we'll decriminalise marijuana, cocaine, heroin, ice, fentanyl. They're not just going marijuana anyway. And my biggest fear is that we go the same way, and I'm almost certain that we will. Now, the point you made about the purity of the drug, etc. So this is why, to me, the legalisation, etc., will not ever work. And that is that, okay, so going back to your days on heroin, you're scratching around to find the money for your next hit, right? So you've got the choice of buying your head off a criminal for $10, or you're paying $50 for a government endorsed product. Which one are you going to buy?
No, that is a fair point, that the black market's always going to exist, and
it's always going to be cheaper.
Yeah.
The only way, and this is a point that I really want to make, the only way that decriminalisation or legalisation can genuinely work, where the drugs are more pure, they know where they're coming from, etc., etc. The only way it will work is if it's taxpayer funded and drug addicts are not paying anything for their drug. Basically, we're funding their habit, because otherwise they're still going to go to the criminals.
Yeah.
Criminals don't go away. They're going to keep coming up with something worse. And I don't know have you heard of Kush?
Oh, no.
Some people call marijuana Kush, I think, but Sierra Leone, this is almost unbelievable, but it's true. Sierra Leone, they're putting security around cemeteries because people are going and digging up bodies to grind down the bones to put in their drugs, and the drug is called Kush.
Oh.
And that's the depravity that comes to people who are on hard drugs.
Now, why do you think the government's trying to legalise drugs? And when we talk about drugs, I think it's the drugs that we can both agree on that shouldn't be decriminalised, the harder drugs. But why do you think there is that push?
Because, along with many other things, I don't think the government has our best interest at heart. I think that there'll be big business that are pushing for this because there'll be money to be made. But more than anything, you've got the Legalise Cannabis Party, for instance, at the moment, and you've got the Greens are on board with decriminalisation of drugs, and our Labor governments will pander to those minority parties.
Do you feel there's an agenda behind it, or it is as simple as that? What's that agenda?
The agenda is, chaos makes life easier for politicians. It is a case of if we're not all in this together and if we're not calling them out and getting on to them to do the right thing by us, by joining together, by being united, then they get life easier as politicians. So chaos, disunity, lack of cohesion in society is an advantage to our government.
And for people that are watching this that are, concerned about whether it's legalisation of even marijuana, but the heavier drugs, what can they do? Or have we really lost it?
We really need to get loud. We need to get loud about a lot of things that are going on in our country, and we need to observe what's going on elsewhere and say, we don't want to be like that.
Like where?
San Francisco, Oregon, Vancouver, Colorado, and we will go down that path, and it's a bad path.
Are you saying San Francisco is not a lovely place to hang around these days?
Apparently not. I haven't been there, but believe me. There's plenty of stories out there.
Between big tech, homelessness, homeless camps, tent camps, I think they call them, what do they call them, and junkies, you don't reckon it's a lovely place to hang out?
It's not somewhere I desire to go, no. I've got to say. No, and it's incredibly sad. One of the places that only 10 years ago you heard people saying wonderful things about, and you just wanted to go there. And now it's like a war zone.
If you think this conversation on where we're taking our country when it comes to legalising drugs is as important as I do, make sure to like, comment, most importantly, share it far and wide and get your family and friends involved in the conversation before it's too late. We definitely don't want to see Australia turning into America and Canada, so it's up to you guys to do something about it right now. And if you think that these local issues and these conversations are important, please head over to buildourstudio.com and help us by getting involved in the most exciting project we have going on at the moment, buildourstudio.com. We're building a brand new state-of-the-art studio to be able to have more conversations like this, the kind of conversations that the mainstream media kind of want to ignore and act like it's all hunky-dory until it's too late. buildourstudio.com. Check out all the details there and join us on this exciting project.